We would like to send out a special thanks to Sock Club for supporting The Trail Went Cold, and we would like to thank you, the listeners, by offering you the chance to earn 15% off your next order of socks when you visit sockclub.com/cold and use the discount code COLD. That's sockclub.com/cold, and the discount code is COLD. Enjoy the show. February 24th, 1978. Chico, California. After embarking on a road trip to attend a basketball game, 5 mentally disabled young men begin the 50-mile drive back to their homes in Yuba County, but never arrive. 4 days later, their abandoned car is found in some snow on an isolated mountain road, but the 5 men have gone missing. After the spring thaw hits, the remains of 4 of the victims are discovered at different locations throughout the area, but the 5th missing man, Gary Mathias, is never found. While foul play is not suspected, a large number of troubling unanswered questions, such as why these men wound up in the area to begin with, leave the deaths of the Yuba County 5 shrouded in mystery. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and under our old schedule, we would ordinarily be releasing a mini-sode right now, but as you probably heard, our podcast is no longer alternating between longer episodes and shorter mini-sodes, so I decided to pick a very special case to cover today. It's the strange tale of 5 men from Yuba County, California, and for the sake of brevity, I've decided to title this episode The Yuba County 5. And because this case is so obscure, I can guarantee this is the first time you've ever heard the phrase Yuba County 5 before. On every episode, you're always hearing me make reference to the Unresolved Mystery subreddit, a place where I frequently post about and discuss the cases featured on this podcast. Well, back in July of this year, a user named Wordblender put up a post there titled American Dyatlov Pass, and the featured mystery was so compelling that it has become one of the most heavily discussed cases in the history of that subreddit. Earlier this month, a listener named Aaron posted about this case in our Trail Went Cold Facebook discussion group, and the reactions clearly indicated that you folks really wanted me to cover it on the podcast. Within days, I also got email requests from listeners named Jamie and Marnix to cover it, so I knew I had to tackle this one. The story involves the disappearance of 5 mentally disabled young men who went missing on a road trip before the remains of 4 of the victims were eventually found in an isolated mountain area. For years, the one victim who wasn't found, Gary Mathias, had his own brief profile page on the Charlie Project, and this seemed like nothing more than a sad, tragic case of a group of people who got lost in the wilderness and died of exposure. However, Megan from the Charlie Project recently uncovered a 1978 Washington Post article titled 5 Boys Who Never Came Back, which provided a lot more details about this story. And once you read them, this becomes a much more baffling mystery than you'd expect. If you're wondering what American Dyatlov Pass means, that's a reference to the Dyatlov Pass incident, which is considered to be one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries of all time. The incident involved 5 hikers who went camping in the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union in 1959 and were found dead under bizarre circumstances. While there's a lot to suggest the victims died from hypothermia, there were so many other strange details, such as unexplained physical trauma to some of the bodies, that this remains a heavily discussed mystery. This particular case was nicknamed American Dyatlov Pass because there are some parallels between the two stories. The victims here probably just died of hypothermia and exposure, but there are a lot of bizarre unanswered questions about how they wound up in this situation to begin with. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the bizarre story of the Yuba County Five. Our story begins in California in 1978 and involves 5 young men from Yuba County: 30-year-old Jack Madruga, 24-year-old Jackie Hewitt, 32-year-old Ted Weir, 29-year-old Bill Sterling, and 25-year-old Gary Mathias, aka the Yuba County Five. In spite of their ages, the reason the Washington Post article I referenced was titled 5 Boys Who Never Came Home is because all 5 of them had developmental disabilities and still lived with their parents. Jackie, Ted, and Bill had been diagnosed as mentally handicapped, and even though Jack was never officially diagnosed and had served in the Army, he was thought of as slow. Gary had also served in the Army, but got a psychiatric discharge due to mental illness. He had a tendency to become violent and had been charged with assault on 2 separate occasions. After being hospitalized several times, Gary was officially diagnosed with schizophrenia. However, by this point, Gary was taking medication on a consistent basis, and his schizophrenia had been in remission for 2 years. In spite of their disabilities, all 5 men were high-functioning, frequently held down jobs, and had some degree of independence. In fact, in addition to serving in the Army, Gary and Jack both possessed driver's licenses. They were all members of Gateway Projects, a vocational rehabilitation center for the handicapped in Yuba City. Bill lived in Yuba City, Jack and Jackie hailed from the nearby town of Marysville, and Gary and Ted lived in the town of Olivehurst, about 4 miles south. On the evening of February 24th, the 5 men were planning to attend a college basketball game at California State University in the city of Chico. The day after that, they were scheduled to play in a Special Olympics basketball tournament in Sacramento as members of the Gateway Projects team, and the winners would receive a week-long trip to Los Angeles and get the chance to visit Disneyland. Since Jack had a license, he would make the 50-mile drive from Yuba County to Chico in his 1969 Mercury Montego. The 5 men attended the basketball game and left the university at around 10 p.m. before stopping at a nearby market to buy some food. After this, the group was scheduled to travel straight back home, but this would turn out to be the last time they were ever seen alive. None of the 5 men returned, and their families soon contacted the police and reported them missing. On February 28th, Jack's abandoned Mercury Montego was found on a deserted bumpy service road in the Sierra Nevada mountain range near a heavily wooded area of Plumas National Forest. The car was located at a level of around 4,500 feet right at the snow line, and it was resting in about 10 inches of snow. The vehicle was unlocked, one of the windows was rolled down, and programs from the basketball game, along with wrappers from the food purchased at the market in Chico, were found inside. However, there was no sign of any of the 5 missing men. What was particularly strange was that this location was 70 miles east of Chico and way off the beaten path of the group's route home. The 50-mile journey from Chico to Yuba County should have involved driving east on California State Route 99 and then south on Route 70. In order to arrive at this particular location, one would have to turn off Route 70 near the town of Oroville onto the Oroville-Quincy Highway, but the car wound up being abandoned around 35 miles northeast of Route 70, and as far as anyone knew, none of the 5 men had ever been in this area before and had no conceivable reason to go there. And even though the Montego was resting in snow, it was not actually stuck and could have easily been pushed free. While the keys were missing, the police were able to hotwire the vehicle and move it without any trouble. It also still had a quarter tank of gas, was in operable condition, and there were maps of California in the glove compartment. So what could have prompted the group to drive to this location and then abandon their vehicle? Unfortunately, a blizzard soon hit the area, so it was impossible to perform a thorough search for the missing men. Since there was no fear of snow when they originally left on their trip, none of them were dressed for this type of weather. In fact, Ted's grandmother had attempted to persuade him to take a coat, but Ted insisted he wouldn't need one. Given that the snow near the road was 4 to 6 feet deep at that time, and the men were not wearing appropriate clothing or footwear, their families feared the worst. The case took a strange turn when a motorist named Joseph Shones came forward. On February 24th, Shones was driving up that same mountain road on his way to a cabin he owned when his Volkswagen Bug got stuck in the snow at around 5:30 p.m. When Shones attempted to free the vehicle, he suffered what turned out to be a mild heart attack and was in such pain that he decided to lie down inside his car with the engine and heat running. Sometime later that night, at approximately 11:30 or so, Shones claimed he heard some whistling noises and turned to see headlights about 50 yards down the road behind him. Now, this is where things get a bit confusing because there are two separate articles, one from the Los Angeles Times on March 20th and one from the Washington Post on July 6th, which mention this part of the story, and they have contradictory information. In the Times article, Shones described seeing what he believed were a group of people in two sets of headlights from two different vehicles, one of which may have been a pickup truck. Shones claimed he yelled for help, but that he was ignored, and that the group of people left in one of the vehicles. In the Post article, there is no mention of the pickup truck, and instead, Shones described seeing what looked like a group of men and a woman with a baby walking and talking in the glare of the headlights. When Shones called for help, he said the headlights went out and then the talking stopped. Shones then described lying back down in his car and later seeing what he believed were flashlight beams outside his window. Once again, when Shones called for help, the lights immediately went out. Shones claimed that he remained inside his vehicle until it ran out of gas, and then he started walking down the road, where he passed by a vehicle which turned out to be the Mercury Montego. Shones traveled 8 miles to a lodge, where he was able to summon help and was taken to a hospital to be treated for his heart attack. Now, if you're wondering why there are contradictory details about a pickup truck, Shones himself acknowledged that because he was half-conscious and not exactly lucid at the time, he could not be entirely sure he actually saw a second vehicle, so that might explain the different details about his story 4 months later. But it's also worth noting that an eyewitness believes she saw the 5 missing men at her store in the nearby town of Brownsville on the afternoon of February 25th. According to the witness, 2 of the men were inside the store, one of them was talking in a telephone booth, and the other 2 were in a parked red pickup truck. Anyway, there wouldn't be any answers until the spring thaw finally hit. On June 4th, a group of motorcyclists showed up at a deserted Forest Service trailer campground and noticed a terrible smell from one of the 60-foot trailers. When they looked inside through a broken window, they noticed a decomposing body on a bunk bed and notified the authorities. When police arrived, they would soon identify the deceased victim as Ted Weir. Even though the trailer was locked, it seemed apparent that he had accessed it by breaking the window, but later died of exposure. 8 sheets were pulled up over Ted's body and wrapped around his head. Due to the amount of beard growth on his face, and the fact that he had lost between 80 and 100 pounds, it was estimated that Ted was alive around 8 to 13 weeks since he was last seen. His ring, necklace, and wallet, which still had cash inside, were also on a nearby table, but curiously, a gold Waltham watch with its crystal was also sitting there, even though neither Ted nor any of the 4 missing men owned such a watch. Ted's leather shoes were missing, and his feet were badly frostbitten, but the most intriguing clue was a pair of tennis shoes which were determined to belong to Gary Mathias. Since Ted had a larger foot size, it was theorized that Gary might have taken his shoes because his feet had become so swollen with frostbite that he could no longer handle his own sneakers. But what happened to Gary afterward? There were a bunch of other troubling questions. The trailer had a propane tank which was never turned on, and even though there were matches, paperback books, and wooden furniture inside, no one had ever attempted to start a fire. A bunch of empty C-ration food cans were found, which had been obtained from an outside storage shed. However, the shed also contained an unopened locker, which contained an extra supply of food so large that it could have fed multiple individuals for an entire year. But the most baffling aspect of this discovery was the sheer distance of the trailer from the location where the abandoned vehicle was found, which would have required a lengthy walk uphill on mountainous terrain through several feet of snow. Now here's another aspect of the story with contradictory information. If you read the articles which were written right after Ted's body was found, they state the trailer was located 7 miles away. However, later articles, including the aforementioned one from the Washington Post, claim that the trailer was over 19 miles away from where the vehicle was found. The day after Ted's body was found, the skeletal remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were discovered 4.5 miles south of the trailer. Their bodies were on opposite sides of the road and had been scattered throughout the area by animals. 2 days after that, partial skeletal remains belonging to Jackie Hewitt were discovered along the same road at a location which was about 2 miles away from the trailer. However, in spite of an extensive search of the area, no trace of Gary Mathias was ever found. As mentioned earlier, Gary took medication to treat schizophrenia and had a consistent routine of taking 3 pills in the morning and 3 pills at night every day. But Gary did not have the medication with him when he left on the trip, and would likely wind up in a terrible state if he went over a week or 2 without it, so there was very little hope of him being found alive. The only other piece of evidence to be found were 3 wool Forest Service blankets and a rusted flashlight, which were discovered about a quarter-mile northwest of the trailer. While investigators found it unlikely that Jack or Bill made it to the trailer alive, they believed Gary and Jackie were in there at some point before they left. The police did not find any signs of foul play with the deceased victims, who probably all died of exposure, but there were still many questions about how they wound up in this situation in the first place. Anyway, even though the case initially got a bit of coverage in the media, it completely faded from the spotlight after the victims' remains were found, and the last article I could find about it was written in the LA Times in March of 1979. This story was pretty much forgotten about for nearly 40 years, until there was sudden reinvigorated interest among online sleuths once it was featured on the Charlie Project blog and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit this past summer. However, it has not received any more coverage in the media. Gary Mathias is still technically a missing person, and there are no answers about the circumstances which led to the deaths of the Yuba County Five. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our new sponsor, Sock Club, as we are very excited that they are now supporting The Trail Went Cold. The holidays are right around the corner, and Sock Club is delivering the perfect gift experience. This is a good time to remind your loved ones that you care each month with quality, American-made socks. The socks are sent straight to your door, featuring a different modern classic design each month that is perfect to add sophisticated fun to any wardrobe. Each package also contains a personalized gift message that can be customized each month. I am pleased to say that I have now teamed up with Sock Club, and they are offering us all 15% off. If you want to give a little reminder of your love every month, then give Sock Club. I just received a shipment of new socks from Sock Club, and it's a good thing too, because we have some pretty cold Canadian winters up here, and I desperately needed them. Before this, my drawer was filled with nothing but plain old boring worn down black socks, but thanks to Sock Club, I'm going to spend my lead up to Christmas wearing socks which are not only extremely warm and comfortable, but also very vibrant and colorful and will help put me into the holiday spirit. So if you want to experience the same thing, take advantage of our special offer and go to sockclub.com/cold and get 15% off when you use the discount code COLD. That's sockclub.com/cold and you use the discount code COLD for 15% off. Thank you and enjoy the rest of our episode. Well, I'd say this is pretty much the working definition of a mystery in which we know the how, but we're utterly confused about the why. It's very unlikely that any of those men were victims of foul play, and even though Gary Mathias was never found, The most logical explanation is that he suffered the same fate and simply died of exposure, but his remains were scattered by animals and just haven't been found, which is a very common occurrence when people go missing in the wilderness. But the big question is how these guys even wound up in these circumstances to begin with. No matter how hard you brainstorm, it's impossible to come up with a theory which makes 100% complete sense. I've made mention of how this case was nicknamed American Dyatlov Pass, but the key difference is that there's a ton of material out there about the original Dyatlov Pass incident from the Soviet Union, whereas the only sources we have for this one are a couple of old newspaper articles. It is possible to come up with logical explanations for a lot of the strange stuff in the Dyatlov Pass incident, but I'm not sure you can say the same about the Yuba County 5, though I do concede that because of the sometimes contradictory information in the newspaper articles about this case, key parts of the story may have been left out or exaggerated. But I think the main reason people have become so caught up in this mystery is because the victims were all mentally disabled, which not only makes this an incredibly tragic story, but can also account for some of their actions. These men somehow wound up in an unthinkable situation, and given the circumstances, you cannot expect them to make the most sensible and rational decisions. It's interesting to read some of the old newspaper articles and see how, well, less politically correct they were 39 years ago. Excuse me for saying this, but some of the headlines from back then literally read, "Retarded men missing." I think the usage of that word might have caused some misconceptions about these 5 men, because even though they had disabilities, they were fairly high functioning, and 2 of them, Jack Madruga and Gary Mathias, served in the army and had driver's licenses. Let's put it this way, if these guys couldn't handle themselves at all, I somehow doubt they would have been taking a 50-mile unsupervised road trip to begin with. All that being said, even if these guys could function well in normal, everyday life, if you put them all in an incredibly stressful situation, like getting lost in the middle of nowhere, then their functioning is bound to deteriorate. Not to mention that they most likely wound up getting hypothermia out there, and when that happens, you're bound to experience mental confusion and start acting irrationally, no matter who you are. However, the most baffling thing about this case is that before these guys got lost in the wilderness, they had to drive to that isolated mountain road in the first place, and that's the one part of this story which no one can understand. The location where the Mercury Montego was found is so far out of the way that I cannot believe that this was just a simple case of getting lost. Like I said earlier, the 50-mile trip from Chico to Yuba County should have involved nothing more than traveling east on Route 99 and then south on Route 70, and there's no reason whatsoever for them to have gotten off the highway. Even if you account for the fact that it was dark and they might have made a wrong turn somewhere, it would take a lot of work to get out onto that service road, as it was around 35 miles from Route 70. If you look at the map of that route, you'll see that after traveling east from Chico on Route 99, you get to a point where you reach Route 70, and it splits off into 2 directions, south towards Marysville and northeast into the Sierra Nevada area. So it is possible they could have made a wrong turn there and went northeast on Route 70, though there's a question about whether they could have found a turnoff from there which would lead them to that particular service road. The most logical explanation is that they might have gone south on Route 70 and then turned left at Oroville and gone east on the Oroville-Quincy Highway. But even so, the service road is still 8 miles off that particular highway, so we're talking a lot of driving on some isolated rural roads. I know we're talking about guys who were operating at a diminished mental capacity, but it just seems like you could not accidentally wind up in that particular area unless you were going there on purpose. But there's also the fact that 2 of the guys lived in Marysville, 2 of the others lived 4 miles south of Marysville in Olivehurst, but Bill Sterling actually lived in Yuba City, which is 2 miles west of Marysville. If they were planning to drop Bill off first, then the most logical route would be to travel south directly from Chico to Yuba City on Route 99 without turning off onto Route 70, and then you just drive 2 miles east from Yuba City to Marysville. So if they were planning to travel the entire trip on Route 99 without passing the turnoff onto the Oroville-Quincy Highway, then there's no reason they ever should have wound up in the mountains. Of course, I don't know their exact travel plan that night, but since Jack was the one behind the wheel, and he lived in Marysville, you'd think his first stop would be in Yuba City to drop Bill off. But then again, since the group was traveling together to Sacramento for another basketball game the next day, Maybe Bill was planning to spend the night with one of the others. Even so, nothing about their trip makes sense. One theory which was presented at the time is that Gary Mathias apparently had a friend in Forbstown, a hamlet which is located over 20 miles east of Oroville and would involve driving on the Oroville-Quincy Highway. So if Gary somehow convinced the others to drive there, or since he had a license of his own, he took the wheel from Jack and attempted to drive there himself, it's easy to see how they might have gotten lost, as the turnoff to the road to Forbstown is apparently very easy to miss, particularly late at night. It's been theorized that if Gary had been skimping out on taking his medication and got behind the wheel that night, he could have had an episode which somehow led to the entire group winding up in the middle of nowhere. But as far as I know, Gary was very consistent with taking his medication for the past 2 years, and there's no evidence he hadn't been taking it, or that he was planning to meet anyone in Forbstown that night. One of the articles I read described all these guys as homebodies, who lived their lives following a simple, comfortable routine, so it sounds like it would have been very out of character for them to make an unscheduled trip somewhere else that night without telling their families. If they said they were planning to come straight home from the basketball game and would be back that night, you could pretty much take them at their word. By all accounts, these guys were very excited about the basketball game they were going to be playing in the following day, and Gary in particular had kept telling his mother, "We got a big game Saturday, don't you let me oversleep." So it's hard to imagine them deciding to travel elsewhere and stay out late with such a big game tomorrow. There's also a big question about their vehicle winding up at that specific location, and here's a direct quote from the Washington Post article. "And the car's underside was undamaged. This heavy American car, with a low-hanging muffler, and presumably with 5 full-grown men inside, had wound up on a stretch of tortuously bumpy mountain road, apparently in total darkness, without a gouge or dent or thick mud stain to show for it. The driver had either used astonishing care and precision, the investigators figured, or else he knew the road well enough to anticipate every rut." Well, it doesn't sound like any of these 5 guys knew that road at all, and even though Jack Madruga had a driver's license, I have my doubts that he was such a skilled driver that he could navigate a bumpy road that carefully in the middle of the night. So I think the question they're trying to ask is, could someone else have driven the vehicle there that night? Well, this point might be supported by the eyewitness testimony of Joseph Shones, who apparently reported seeing a second vehicle at that location and a woman carrying a baby. But given the contradictory information in the articles which mention Shones, it's hard to know what parts of his story to believe. Remember, the guy had just suffered a mild heart attack, and by his own admission, he might have been hallucinating about the things he saw. And given that it was dark and he was 50 yards away, maybe he mistook one of the men carrying something else with a woman carrying a baby. Now, I know there is some skepticism about Shones' story. It might seem unusual that Shones would just lie in his vehicle for a while before deciding to make an 8-mile walk down the mountain to seek help at a lodge, but I don't find that part of the story too unusual. His vehicle got stuck at around 5:30 p.m., just after when the sun would have gone down, and given that he was in great pain at the time, he probably figured it was wiser to seek shelter in his warm vehicle and hope that help arrived, rather than attempt to trek down a mountain on a cold, dark night. When his car ran out of gas, he decided to walk for help, and it's worth mentioning that Shones had stopped at that particular lodge to have a drink on a previous occasion, so he would have known it was there. Now, Shones claimed that when he saw people emerge from the vehicle and he called down for help, they turned off the headlights and disappeared from sight. This sounds like it might be a key part of this story, because if 5 mentally disabled men were stranded out there and heard a strange voice calling for them, then I can see them becoming frightened and taking off, which might have caused them to get lost, and explains why they never returned to their vehicle. I'm not sure what to make of Shones' claims that he saw flashlight beams from his car, because I'm not sure the 5 men would have even had flashlights with them. I know they did find a rusted flashlight alongside some Forest Service blankets months later, but I always assumed that that flashlight came from the trailer. I do acknowledge that it seems like one hell of a coincidence that 2 separate vehicles could get stuck 50 yards from one another on this very isolated service road on the exact same night. And the one part of this story which has never been explained in any of the articles is what exactly became of Shones' Volkswagen Bug. I mean, I have to assume they retrieved it at the same time they found the Mercury Montego, but that was 4 days later. However, for the most part, It seems like Shones' story did check out, so I think it's likely he did see the Montego and the 5 men up there, but whether he actually saw anybody else is up for debate. Now, we have an eyewitness account from a woman who claims she saw the 5 men at her store in Brownsville on February 25th, but I'm inclined to think she was mistaken. This type of thing happens in missing persons cases all the time. It's funny because she describes seeing 2 of the men in a pickup truck, 2 of them inside the store, and 1 of them in a phone booth, but there's no indication she actually saw all of them together, so she probably saw a couple of different people who had no real connection to one another and assumed they were the 5 missing men. It just doesn't make sense for them to be in Brownsville, especially when you consider how excited they were to be playing a basketball game in Sacramento on that particular day, and I seriously doubt they left the mountains, traveled to Brownsville, and then wound up dead in the mountains again. No, the most logical explanation is that the 5 men abandoned their vehicle by the side of the road, got lost in the wilderness, and never made it back to civilization. But there are still a lot of questions about how they ended up the way they did. Even though their vehicle was not stuck in the snow, and they could have easily pushed it out, I certainly understand why that didn't happen, as these were 5 mentally disabled people who were trapped in a situation they had probably never been in before, so they were probably not thinking rationally. And if the theory is correct about them running away from the scene because they became frightened after hearing Joseph Schoen's voice calling for help, then I can see how their panic might have gotten even worse. If you got stuck while traveling up a mountain, the most logical solution would be to travel downhill in order to seek help, but these guys' remains were found several miles uphill. But again, it was dark and they may have been frightened out of their minds, so they might not have been thinking at all about what direction they were traveling in. So after they left the scene, what could have happened to them afterward? Here's what we know about the ultimate fates of the Yuba County 5. At the very least, Ted Weir made it to the Forest Service trailer and probably managed to live at least 8 weeks before he died. The locations where Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling's remains were found seems to indicate that they died of exposure before they reached the trailer. Since his shoes were inside the trailer, it seems likely that Gary Mathias was there at some point and might have taken Ted's shoes, left the trailer, and died somewhere else. Jackie Hewitt was found a relatively short distance from the trailer, and one theory investigators had was that Jackie was there when Ted died, but became so frightened by the sight of his friend's body that he left and ultimately wound up dying of exposure. 8 sheets were wrapped around Ted's body so tightly that it seems likely someone else did that after he passed away. I know some people might think an unknown stranger was in the trailer because a gold watch was found which didn't belong to any of the 5 men. However, I think it's likely it just belonged to someone who had worked inside that trailer on a previous occasion and left it behind, and that the watch has no connection to this case. Judging by the empty food cans, it seems like whoever was there was able to eat for a little while before starvation set in. Even though a year's supply worth of extra food was found in a locker inside the storage shed, I don't find it too surprising that they might have failed to notice the locker and open it to check. I can also understand why developmentally disabled people might not think to turn on the propane tank or start a fire to warm themselves, but I do acknowledge Jack and Gary both served in the Army, so you'd think they might have had survival training and known to do something like that. But it seems unlikely Jack made it to the trailer, and even if Gary did, remember that he didn't have the medication to treat his schizophrenia, so who knows what state of mind he would have been in at that time. When you take that into account, then you can understand why Gary might have chosen to leave the trailer and disappear. But even if you acknowledge that these guys were suffering from hypothermia and not thinking rationally and stop questioning the decisions they made, there's still quite a bit about this story which doesn't make much sense. If these guys walked away from their vehicle, it just seems mind-boggling that any of them could have survived long enough to even make it to the trailer in the first place, particularly if it was over 19 miles away. We're talking about 5 mentally disabled people who were walking uphill in very cold weather through snow that was about 4 to 6 feet deep, and none of them were wearing the appropriate clothing or footwear. I mentioned earlier that it's possible that the whole 19 miles thing might be exaggerated, as some of the articles state that the trailer was only 7 miles away from the vehicle. But even so, that's a hell of a long hike in those conditions, especially when you're dressed in nothing more than street clothes and street shoes. And considering that none of these guys were familiar with the area, it's almost a miracle that they would manage to come across that trailer. In fact, the deputy sheriff was even quoted in one of the articles as saying, if you didn't know where it was at, it would be 1 in 1,000 of finding that kind of place. And also, even when you put aside the question of why Ted never bothered to turn on the propane or even attempted to start a fire in the trailer, how did he even manage to live that long without any source of heat at all? I mean, when you look at Ted's massive beard growth and the fact that he lost 80 pounds, it's pretty clear cut that he survived for several weeks after he got stranded. But we're talking very cold weather in late February, March, and possibly early April. And if Ted never started one fire during that time period, then it just seemed like he should have died of exposure a lot quicker than he did. That's just one of the elements of this case where there just doesn't seem to be any logical explanation. Ultimately, this should be nothing more than a cut-and-dried case of 5 men becoming lost in the wilderness and dying of exposure, but there are enough inexplicable elements to make one think there's more to this story. I've always wondered if these guys met somebody at the basketball game who followed them or convinced them to travel elsewhere, but you also have to account for the fact that they stopped at a market to buy food after they left the game, and there was no one else with them, and nothing seemed to be amiss. But something had to happen which led to them winding up 35 miles from the highway on that isolated mountain road. If Joseph Schoen's sightings of the pickup and the woman with the baby are accurate, you have to wonder if someone else traveled up there with the 5 men. For reasons unknown, these people either kidnapped them or convinced them to leave their Montego by the side of the road and drove them away from the scene. Perhaps the 5 men were taken into the mountains and abandoned at another location. Even though some of them died of exposure, they were dropped off in close enough proximity to the trailer that Ted managed to make it there without having to walk 19 miles and survive there for several more weeks. Of course, this theory is a big reach, because I can't think of any reason why someone would kidnap these guys and just abandon them like that. Ted's jewelry and wallet were found in the trailer, and there was still cash inside, so it doesn't look like robbery was a motive. My other thought is that maybe they accidentally came across something out there which they shouldn't have seen, which is why they were taken away from their vehicle. But if that's the case, why not just kill them rather than stranding them alone in the wilderness? The authorities did not believe there was any foul play here, so if other people were involved in what happened, then I don't believe there was murder. I don't know, I've always wondered if more light would have been shed on what happened if the remains of Gary Mathias had turned up. He was the one who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had a history of violent episodes before he received the proper medication, so you can't help but wonder if he's the reason those 5 guys wound up out there. That's not to say I believe he got violent and murdered anybody, but if Gary somehow got behind the wheel of that car and there was something wrong with him at the time, then that might go a long way at explaining why they traveled to that location. I will acknowledge that the lack of information out there about this case might have caused it to balloon into a story which sounds a lot more mysterious than it really is. After all, some details about the Dyatlov Pass incident have been exaggerated over the years, and some experts believe that mystery is nothing more than a tragic story of 9 people dying of hypothermia. The same logic applies here, and as interesting as that Washington Post article from 1978 is, it does contain some sloppy mistakes and pretty noticeable typos. So if this article got some of the more baffling details wrong, such as the alleged 19-mile journey from the car to the trailer, then I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. There really isn't much mystery about how these guys died, but the unknown circumstances of how they got to that point are enough to drive you insane. Mysterious or not, one cannot forget that this is a very sad, tragic, and haunting story involving 5 helpless victims, and I can only imagine the sheer terror they might have been feeling in that situation, as they probably just did not have the mental capacity to deal with it. But if there's anyone from this area who knows more information about this story which wasn't mentioned in this podcast or any of the articles, I invite them to contact me, especially if they can shed more light on what happened. Anyway, it doesn't sound like this is an open homicide investigation, but since Gary Mathias is still technically a missing person, I guess this case isn't completely closed. So if you happen to have any information about the whereabouts of Gary Mathias, or you know something about the deaths of the Yuba County 5 which you think merits a criminal investigation, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder at iCloud.com. So once again, a big shout out to the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the Charlie Project for posting about this story this past summer and reinvigorating interest in this case. We'll see how much traction the quote-unquote American Dyatlov Pass gains, and if this story about the Yuba County 5 gets more attention, we might even be able to find out the full truth about what actually happened someday. Anyway, I also need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group, so if you feel like discussing the podcast or the cases we feature with myself and your fellow listeners, feel free to join, and I'll approve your entry into the group ASAP. Earlier this month, we also opened a new online store and are now selling Trail Went Cold merchandise, such as t-shirts, mugs, and stickers, so feel free to visit our website, trailwentcold.com, and click on the store button if you wish to purchase anything. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.